The gunshot that killed her father echoed in Jane Riley's mind every single day, and when the ranch hand dropped a bucket behind her 3 months later, she threw herself against the barn wall so hard she bruised her shoulder. Santa Fe, New Mexico had been her home for all 21 years of her life, but after that night when outlaws rode onto their ranch demanding money her father did not have, every sound became a threat. The crack of thunder, the slam of a door, even the pop of wood in the fireplace sent her heart racing and her body into a defensive crouch. Her mother had taken ill from grief 2 weeks after the funeral and passed quietly in her sleep, leaving Jane alone with a failing ranch and debts she could not pay. The bank had given her until the end of September 1878 to settle accounts, and now October was breathing down her neck with winter following close behind. She tried to manage the property herself, but the remaining ranch hands grew frustrated with her constant startled responses. When they gathered in the morning to receive instructions, Jane would jump at the sound of boots on the porch. During meals, the clatter of tin plates made her flinch so violently that she spilled coffee across the table. The men meant well, but their heavy footsteps and booming voices left her in a perpetual state of anxiety. One by one, they drifted away to find work elsewhere, until only old Miguel remained, and he was too frail to handle the physical labor the ranch required. The notice from the bank arrived on a gray morning in mid-October. Jane held the paper with trembling hands, reading the words that confirmed what she already knew. The ranch would be seized in 2 weeks unless she could pay $800, a sum that might as well have been $8,000 for all her ability to produce it. She had 30 head of cattle, but they were too thin to fetch good prices at market. The horses were in better condition, but selling them would leave her with no way to work the land or travel to town. She was sitting on the porch steps, the notice still clutched in her fingers, when she heard the approach of a horse. The sound of hoofbeats sent her scrambling backward, and she pressed herself against the door frame, her breath coming in short gasps. The rider came into view slowly, and she noticed immediately that something was different. The horse walked at an easy pace, and the man in the saddle sat relaxed in a way that suggested he had all the time in the world. He was tall, with dark hair that touched his collar, and a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore a dusty brown hat, a faded blue shirt, and denim pants that had seen better days. The man stopped his horse a good distance from the porch and removed his hat, revealing kind eyes the color of creek water in summer. He did not call out or make any sudden movements. Instead, he simply waited, holding his hat against his chest, until Jane's breathing slowed enough for her to speak. "Can I help you?" Her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. "I hope I can help you, miss," he said quietly. His voice was low and gentle, barely carrying across the space between them. "My name is Ethan Masters. I heard in town that you might need a ranch hand." Jane studied him warily. She had not posted any notice in town, had not spoken to anyone about her situation except the banker, who had regarded her with pity and impatience in equal measure. "Who told you that?" "Miguel stopped by the livery where I was boarding my horse," Ethan said. "He mentioned you were having some difficulties." She should have known Miguel would try to help, though she had no money to pay a hired hand. "I appreciate you riding out here, but I cannot afford to take anyone on right now." Ethan nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. "Miguel mentioned that too. He also said you might be willing to offer room and board in exchange for work, at least until you get things sorted with the bank." "I do not need charity," Jane said, lifting her chin despite the fear still coursing through her veins. "Not offering charity, miss. I need a place to stay for a while, and I know my way around a ranch, Seems like we could help each other out." He paused, then added, "I will understand if you would rather not. A woman alone should be cautious about who she trusts." Something in his tone, the genuine respect in his words, made Jane hesitate. She did need help desperately, and there was something about this man that did not trigger the same panic as the other ranch hands had. Perhaps it was the way he kept his distance, or the softness of his voice, or the patience with which he waited for her response. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Colorado, most recently. Before that, Kansas, Missouri, Texas. I have been drifting for a few years now." He replaced his hat on his head with slow, deliberate movements. "I can provide references if you would like to wire anyone." Jane considered this. She had perhaps a week before the bank took everything. Even if Ethan Masters only stayed that long, it would be better than facing the inevitable alone. "There is a bunkhouse out back. It needs cleaning, but it has a stove and a bed." "That sounds just fine, Miss Jane," she said. "Jane Riley." "Miss Riley, then." Ethan gathered his reins carefully, telegraphing his movements before he made them. "Should I settle my horse in the barn?" "Yes. Miguel can show you where everything is." Jane stood slowly, still keeping one hand on the door frame for support. "We eat supper at 6. Ethan nodded and turned his horse toward the barn, maintaining that same easy, unhurried pace. Jane watched him go, noticing how he moved with quiet grace despite his size. When he dismounted, he did so smoothly, without the usual thud and jangle that accompanied most cowboys. Even from a distance, she could see that he handled his horse with gentle competence, removing the saddle and bridle with efficient but measured motions. That evening, Jane prepared a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of the preserved vegetables from her mother's garden. She set the table in the kitchen rather than the dining room, which felt too large and empty now. When 6 o'clock arrived, she heard the soft scuff of boots on the porch, then a light knock that barely qualified as a sound. "Come in," she called, bracing herself. Ethan entered quietly, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door. He had washed up and changed into a clean shirt, and his hair was still damp from the pump. Miguel followed behind him, moving with the careful steps of his 70-some years. They sat down to eat, and Jane noticed immediately that Ethan was conscious of every sound he made. He lifted his fork carefully, set his cup down gently, and when he needed the butter, he asked for it in that same low voice rather than reaching across the table. Miguel watched this with knowing eyes, and Jane caught the old man's slight smile of approval. "Miguel told me about your cattle," Ethan said after a few minutes. "He thinks they need to be moved to better grazing before the winter sets in hard." "The north pasture has been rested all summer," Jane said, "but I would need help moving them. We could do that tomorrow if the weather holds." Ethan broke his cornbread into pieces rather than biting directly into it, reducing the sound. "After that, I can take a look at what needs fixing around the place." Jane nodded, focusing on her plate. It had been a long time since she had eaten with anyone other than Miguel, and the presence of a stranger should have made her more nervous than it did. But Ethan's quiet manner was already having an effect on her frayed nerves. She still tensed when Miguel's chair scraped against the floor, but Ethan's careful movements created a pocket of calm that was surprisingly soothing. After supper, Ethan thanked her for the meal and left for the bunkhouse without lingering. Jane helped Miguel to his small room off the kitchen, the one he had occupied since her father first hired him decades ago, then cleaned up the dishes in solitude. Through the window above the wash basin, she could see a dim light in the bunkhouse and the silhouette of Ethan moving around inside. She wondered what had brought him here, why a man who seemed capable and skilled was drifting from place to place without apparent purpose. But those were questions for another day, if ever. For now, she was simply grateful for the help. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the grass. Jane dressed in her riding clothes, thick canvas pants that had belonged to her father, and a wool shirt she had altered to fit her smaller frame. She braided her dark hair and secured it under a wide-brimmed hat, then headed out to the barn where Miguel was already measuring oats for the horses. Ethan appeared from the bunkhouse just as she reached the barn door. He called out a soft greeting while he was still at a distance, giving her time to prepare for his approach. Jane appreciated this more than she could express. The other ranch hands had always seemed to materialize suddenly, startling her with their unexpected presence. They saddled 3 horses and rode out to the south pasture, where the cattle had been grazing on increasingly sparse grass. The work of moving cattle was never quiet, but Ethan managed to conduct it with less chaos than Jane had experienced before. He did not yell or fire his gun into the air. Instead, he used low whistles and calm persistence, guiding rather than driving the animals toward their destination. Jane followed his lead, and even Miguel seemed energized by the steady, peaceful approach. By midday, they had successfully moved all 30 head to the north pasture, where the cattle immediately began grazing on the better grass. Jane allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she watched them settle in. It was a small victory, but it felt significant nonetheless. "They should put on some weight before winter now," Ethan said, bringing his horse alongside hers. He had maintained a respectful distance all morning, never riding too close or approaching from behind where he might startle her. "It will improve your price if you decide to sell." "I may not have a choice about selling," Jane admitted. "The bank wants $800 in less than 2 weeks. Ethan was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking. "How much do you figure you could get for the cattle?" "Maybe 400 if I can get them to market soon and if they look healthy. But that still leaves me 400 short, and I would have no stock left to rebuild." "What about those horses you have in the far corral, the 3 chestnuts?" Jane knew the ones he meant. They were quality animals, descended from a mare her father had prized. "I have been training them, but they are not finished yet. They look pretty far along to me. I watched them this morning while I was checking the fences. They respond well to basic commands, and they have good temperaments." Ethan adjusted his reins, and his horse shifted beneath him. A rancher looking for reliable mounts would pay well for horses like that, especially with winter coming and people wanting to know their animals are solid. "I would need to take them to market myself to get a fair price," Jane said. "The local buyers would rob me blind." "Then we take them to market. There is a big livestock auction in Albuquerque at the end of the month. It draws buyers from all over the territory." Jane considered this. Albuquerque was a 3-day ride from Santa Fe, maybe 4 if they were moving cattle and horses together. The idea of traveling that far, of being in a crowded auction yard with hundreds of men and countless loud noises, made her stomach clench with anxiety. But the alternative was losing the ranch entirely. "I do not know if I can," she said honestly. Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw understanding in his eyes. "You can," he said simply, "and I will be there to help." Something about the quiet certainty in his voice made Jane want to believe him. She nodded slowly, committing herself to a plan that terrified her, but offered the only real hope she had. They spent the next week preparing for the journey. Ethan worked from dawn until dusk, repairing fences, reinforcing the barn roof, and completing a dozen other tasks that had been neglected since her father's death. Jane noticed that he moved around the ranch with exceptional awareness of where she was at any given moment. If she was in the barn, he approached from the front where she could see him coming. If she was in the house, he knocked and waited for her response before entering. He never slammed doors, never dropped tools, and when he needed to chop wood, he did it when she was out riding so the sound of the axe would not send her into a panic. Miguel watched these careful considerations with approval, and one evening he spoke to Jane about it while they were preparing supper. "That one is a good man," the old Mexican said in his accented English. "He has a gentle spirit." "He is very considerate," Jane agreed, stirring the pot of stew. "It is more than that, Mija. He sees your pain and wants to ease it. That is a rare thing in a man." Miguel handed her a handful of herbs from the windowsill garden. "Your father would have liked him." The mention of her father brought the familiar ache to Jane's chest, but it was softer now than it had been. Time and Ethan's calming presence were slowly taking the sharpest edges off her grief. She added the herbs to the stew and said nothing, but she knew Miguel was right. As they prepared for the trip to Albuquerque, Jane found herself spending more time with Ethan, and the more she was around him, the more she noticed things. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. The competence of his hands as he worked with leather and rope and wood. The patience he showed with the horses, never harsh, always firm but kind. He spoke little about his own past, offering only small details when asked directly. She learned that he was 27 years old, that his parents had died when he was young, and that he had been working ranches and cattle drives since he was 14. "Why do you drift?" she asked him one afternoon as they worked together to groom the horses they would take to auction. "You have skills. You could settle somewhere, build something for yourself." Ethan was quiet for a long time, running a brush along his horse's flank in smooth, rhythmic strokes. "I guess I have been looking for a place that feels like home," he finally said. "Have not found it yet." "What does home feel like?" Jane asked, genuinely curious. He stopped brushing and looked at her across the horse's back. "I think it feels like peace, like you can take a deep breath and not worry about what is coming next." His gaze was steady and open. "Like you belong somewhere and someone would miss you if you left." Jane felt something shift in her chest at those words. She understood that longing for peace more than he could know. For her, peace had died with her parents, replaced by constant vigilance and fear. But in the past week, she had experienced moments of something close to calm, and all of them had occurred in Ethan's quiet presence. They left for Albuquerque on a crisp morning in late October, with Miguel staying behind to watch over the ranch. They drove the 30 cattle and led the 3 chestnuts, along with extra horses for themselves to manage the herd. The journey was slow and demanding, but Ethan made it as easy as possible. He chose their route carefully, avoiding the busiest trails, and he selected their campsites with an eye toward shelter and quiet. Each evening he built their fire and prepared their meals while Jane tended the animals, and they fell into a comfortable rhythm of shared labor. The first night on the trail, Jane woke to the sound of coyotes howling in the distance. She sat up gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs, disoriented and afraid. Before she could spiral into panic, she heard Ethan's low voice from the other side of the dying fire. "It is all right. Just coyotes. They are far off and not interested in us." Jane tried to calm her breathing, wrapping her blanket tighter around her shoulders. The October night was cold, and she was shivering, though she could not tell if it was from the temperature or the adrenaline flooding her system. "Would you like me to build up the fire?" Ethan asked softly. "Yes, please," she managed. She heard him move carefully, adding wood to the embers without loud crackling or sudden movements. The flames grew, casting warm light across their camp, and Jane felt her heartbeat begin to slow. Ethan settled back into his bedroll but did not lie down. Instead, he sat propped against his saddle, his rifle resting across his lap, a silent guardian keeping watch. "You do not have to stay awake," Jane said. "I do not mind. I am a light sleeper anyway." He adjusted his hat against the firelight. "My father used to say that a man who sleeps too soundly on the trail is a man who does not wake up." "Is that what happened to him? Something on the trail?" "No. He and my mother both got cholera when I was 12, went quick within days of each other." Ethan's voice held old sorrow but no bitterness. "I have been on my own since then, mostly." "I am sorry," Jane said. "That must have been hard." "It was, but it taught me to take care of myself." He glanced across the fire at her. "What happened to your parents, if you do not mind me asking?" "Miguel told me they passed recently, but not the circumstances." Jane had not spoken about it in detail to anyone, but something about the darkness and the fire and Ethan's gentle presence made the words come easier. She told him about the outlaws, about her father's refusal to give them money he did not have, about the gunshot that had changed everything. She told him about her mother's broken heart and quiet death, about the way every loud sound now sent her back to that terrible night. Ethan listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I cannot imagine carrying that with you every day," he finally said. "But I want you to know that I see how strong you are. It takes real courage to keep going after something like that." "I do not feel strong," Jane admitted. "I feel broken." "Broken things can heal," Ethan said. "Sometimes they even come back stronger than before, like a bone that has been set right." Jane wanted to believe him. She lay back down, watching the stars wheel overhead through the bare branches of the cottonwoods. Across the fire, Ethan kept his watch, and eventually the sound of his steady breathing and the crackle of the flames lulled her back to sleep. The next 2 days passed in similar fashion. They made good progress with the herd, and the weather held clear and cold. Jane found herself relaxing incrementally, growing accustomed to the rhythm of the trail and the constancy of Ethan's presence. He continued to be mindful of noise and sudden movements, but he also helped her push gently against her fears. When a branch snapped in the wind and she flinched, he calmly pointed out what had caused the sound and waited with her until her breathing settled. When they passed a group of miners heading in the opposite direction, and their loud voices made her tense, he positioned his horse between her and the strangers and engaged them in brief conversation, giving Jane time to adjust. They reached Albuquerque in the afternoon of the 4th day. The town was much larger than Santa Fe, sprawling along the Rio Grande with the Sandia Mountains rising pink and imposing to the east. The livestock yards were on the southern edge of town, a maze of wooden corrals and pens already filling with cattle, horses, sheep, and mules in advance of the next day's auction. The noise was overwhelming: bellowing cattle, neighing horses, shouting men, hammering as workers made repairs to the fences. Jane froze at the entrance to the yards, her hands gripping her reins so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Ethan stopped beside her and surveyed the chaos. "It is a lot," he acknowledged, "but we will take it slow. I will get us registered and find our pen assignments. You stay with the animals right here outside the main yard until I come back. All right?" Jane nodded mutely, grateful beyond words that he was not expecting her to plunge into that maelstrom immediately. Ethan dismounted and approached her, standing close enough that she could hear his quiet voice, but not so close that he invaded her space. "You have already done the hard part," he said. "You got yourself here with these animals, and you are going to see this through. I believe in you, Jane." It was the first time he had used her given name without the title, and the intimacy of it sent warmth through her chest. She met his eyes and saw nothing but confidence and kindness there. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then walked into the yards with that same calm, purposeful stride he always used. Jane waited with the animals, focusing on keeping them calm and trying not to let the distant noise overwhelm her. It felt like a long time before Ethan returned, though it could not have been more than 20 minutes. "Got us 2 pens on the quieter north side," he reported. "We will put the cattle in one and the horses in the other. The auction starts at 8 in the morning, cattle first, then horses around midday." They moved the animals into their assigned pens, and Jane was relieved to find that Ethan had indeed secured spots away from the worst of the activity. There were other ranchers nearby, but they were focused on their own stock and paid little attention to the new arrivals. Ethan helped her water and feed the animals. Then they found a modest boarding house a few blocks from the yards where they could rent rooms for the night. The proprietor was a stout woman with gray hair and sharp eyes. She looked at Jane with concern when she saw how pale and drawn the young woman appeared. "You look like you need a hot bath and a good meal," she declared. "I will have my daughter bring water up to your room and supper will be ready in an hour." Jane thanked her and climbed the stairs to her assigned room, a small but clean space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. When the promised bath arrived, she sank into the hot water gratefully, letting it ease the aches from 4 days on the trail. She washed her hair and scrubbed the dust from her skin, and when she finally dressed in the one good outfit she had brought, a simple blue dress that had been her mother's, she felt more human than she had in days. Supper was served in a common dining room, and Jane found herself seated across from Ethan at a long table with several other guests. He had cleaned up as well and looked handsome in a pressed shirt and vest. The meal was hearty, beef stew and fresh bread, and the other diners were friendly but not intrusive. Jane managed to eat despite her nervousness about the next day, and when a man at the end of the table knocked over his water glass, she flinched but did not panic. Ethan caught her eye and gave her a small, encouraging nod. After supper, they walked back to the livestock yards to check on the animals one last time. The evening was settling in, and the noise had diminished as ranchers and traders returned to their lodgings. Jane moved through the pens, speaking softly to the cattle and horses, reassuring herself that they were settled for the night. "They look good," Ethan said, leaning against the fence rail beside her. "Those horses especially. You did fine work with them." "My father started their training," Jane said. "I just finished what he began." "He taught you well then." Ethan paused, then added, "I have been thinking about what happens after the auction." Jane turned to look at him, anxiety fluttering in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "I mean that once you have paid the bank, you will need help rebuilding your herd, getting the ranch running properly again. I was thinking maybe I could stay on for a while, if you would want that." Jane's heart began to beat faster, but this time it was not from fear. Over the past 2 weeks, she had grown accustomed to Ethan's presence, had come to rely on his steady competence and gentle manner. The thought of him leaving, of returning to the ranch alone, filled her with unexpected sorrow. "I would want that," she said quietly, "but I still cannot pay you much. We can work something out. Maybe a percentage of the profits when you sell your next batch of cattle, or when those horses I have seen you working with are ready for market." He looked out across the pens, his profile outlined by the last of the daylight. "Truth is, I like it at your place. It feels peaceful there, like somewhere I could maybe stop drifting." Jane felt that shift in her chest again, that sense of something changing and aligning. She wanted to tell him that she had felt more at peace in the past 2 weeks than she had since her father died, that his presence had become something she looked forward to rather than feared. But the words felt too large and vulnerable, so she simply said, "I would like it if you stayed." Ethan smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger. "Then I will." They stood together in the gathering darkness, watching the stars emerge one by one above the livestock yards, and Jane felt a fragile hope beginning to take root in her heart. The auction the next day was every bit as overwhelming as Jane had anticipated. By the time they arrived at 7:30 in the morning, the yards were packed with men, and the noise was constant and chaotic. Auctioneers shouted, cattle bellowed, and buyers called out their bids in voices that seemed designed to carry across vast distances. Jane stayed close to Ethan, who navigated the crowd with calm efficiency. He registered their lots, received their numbers, and positioned them where they could watch the proceedings. When their cattle came up for sale, Jane held her breath. The animals looked better than they had 2 weeks ago, the good grazing having added some weight and improved their appearance. The bidding started slow but picked up as buyers recognized the quality of the stock. When the hammer finally fell, they had sold all 30 head for $420, slightly more than Jane had hoped. "That is a good price," Ethan said, his voice close to her ear so she could hear him over the din. "You should be proud." Jane felt a surge of relief so intense that her knees went weak. She leaned against the fence rail, trying to steady herself as the next lot was brought forward. They had a few hours before the horses would be auctioned, so Ethan suggested they get some air and something to eat. They walked to a quiet restaurant away from the yards, and Jane finally allowed herself to relax slightly. $420, she said, still marveling at it. "That means I only need to get $380 from the horses to pay the bank in full." "You will get it," Ethan assured her. "Those are quality animals, and there are plenty of buyers here looking for exactly what you have." He was right. When the horses came up for auction just after midday, the bidding was competitive from the start. Ranchers and freighters recognized the value of well-trained, even tempered mounts, and the 3 chestnuts drew particular attention. By the time all 3 had sold, Jane had earned an additional $530, bringing her total to $950. She stared at the figures written on the paper the auction clerk handed her, hardly able to believe what she was seeing. It was enough to pay the bank with money left over, enough to buy new stock and provisions for the winter, enough to give her a real chance at saving the ranch. "We did it," she said, looking up at Ethan with shining eyes. "You did it," he corrected gently. "Those were your animals, your work." "I could not have done it without you." Jane felt tears threatening, but they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than sorrow. "Thank you, Ethan. Thank you for everything." He smiled that warm, genuine smile again. "You are welcome, Jane." They collected their payment and made arrangements to stay one more night in Albuquerque before beginning the journey home. Without the animals to manage, the return trip would be much faster, perhaps 2 days rather than 4. That evening, they celebrated with a nicer supper than either had enjoyed in months, splurging on steak and potatoes at a restaurant with white tablecloths and candles on the tables. Jane wore her blue dress again, and she caught Ethan looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. Over the meal, they talked about plans for the ranch, about which cattle to buy and when, about the possibility of focusing more on horse breeding since Jane clearly had a talent for it. The conversation flowed easily, and Jane realized that she felt comfortable with him in a way she had never felt with anyone outside her family. As they walked back to the boarding house through the lamplit streets, Ethan suddenly stopped. Jane turned to look at him questioningly. "I want to tell you something," he said, his voice serious. "I have been moving from place to place for years, never staying long, always looking for something I could not quite name. But these past 2 weeks with you, I have felt something I have not felt in a long time. I have felt like I matter to someone, like what I do makes a real difference. And I have felt happy." Jane's breath caught. She could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the way he was opening himself up to possible rejection. It made her brave enough to speak her own truth. "You do matter to me," she said softly. "More than I expected. When I think about you leaving, about going back to the ranch without you there, it makes me sad in a way that has nothing to do with needing help with the work." Ethan stepped closer, slowly and carefully as he always moved around her. "Jane, I know we have not known each other long, but I think I'm falling in love with you. And I want you to know that I will go at whatever pace you need, or I will just be your friend if that is all you want. But I had to tell you the truth." Jane's heart was racing, but it was not the panicked racing of fear. It was the wild, hopeful beating of possibility. She looked up at Ethan's face, at the kindness and strength she saw there, and she made a decision. "I think I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. Ethan's expression transformed with joy. He lifted his hand slowly, telegraphing the movement, and when she did not pull away, he cupped her cheek with infinite gentleness. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," Jane breathed. He leaned down and touched his lips to hers, soft and sweet and perfect. Jane felt the kiss all the way through her body, a warmth that spread from her mouth to her chest to her fingertips. When they finally pulled apart, she was smiling, really smiling for the first time in months. They walked the rest of the way to the boarding house hand in hand, and when they said goodnight outside her door, Ethan kissed her once more, a lingering kiss that promised more to come. The journey back to Santa Fe passed in a golden haze of happiness. Without cattle to move, they made excellent time, riding side by side and talking about everything and nothing. Ethan told her stories from his years of drifting, some funny and some sad, and Jane found herself laughing in a way she had forgotten she could. She told him about growing up on the ranch, about her parents and their love story, about her dreams for the future that she had thought died with them. "Your dreams do not have to die," Ethan said. "We can build something together if you want that." "I do want that," Jane said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They arrived home on the evening of the second day to find Miguel waiting on the porch, his weathered face breaking into a wide smile when he saw them approach hand in hand. The old man asked no questions, simply welcomed them home and listened as Jane excitedly explained about the successful auction. The next morning, Jane and Ethan rode into Santa Fe and walked into the bank together. The banker, Mr. Patterson, looked surprised to see them, and even more surprised when Jane counted out $800 in cash onto his desk. "This settles the debt in full," she said firmly. "I will need a receipt and the deed to my property." Mr. Patterson sputtered and shuffled papers, but eventually he produced the necessary documents. Jane walked out of that bank with her head held high and her hand in Ethan's, free of debt and full of hope for the first time since her father's death. Over the following weeks, they settled into a routine at the ranch. Ethan proved to be an excellent partner in every way, working tirelessly to improve the property while always remaining mindful of Jane's needs. He built her a quieter chicken coop with better hinges so the door would not slam. He wrapped the water pump handle with leather so it would not clang. He taught her techniques for managing her startle response, helping her gradually increase her tolerance for sudden sounds without pushing her too fast. In return, Jane opened her heart to him bit by bit, sharing her fears and hopes, her grief and her growing joy. They worked together to purchase a small herd of quality cattle, and Jane began training 2 new horses with Ethan's help. Miguel watched over them both with grandfatherly affection, clearly delighted by the romance blooming before his eyes. As winter set in, blanketing the ranch in snow and forcing them to spend long evenings inside by the fire, Ethan and Jane grew ever closer. He was patient with her healing, never pushing for more physical intimacy than she was ready to give, content to hold her hand or kiss her gently and let her set the pace. Jane fell more deeply in love with him every day, marveling at his kindness and strength, his humor and his gentleness. On Christmas Eve, as they sat together watching the fire while Miguel dozed in his chair, Ethan turned to Jane with a serious expression. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, carved with intricate designs, and handed it to her. Jane opened it carefully and gasped. Inside was a delicate silver ring set with a small turquoise stone. "It was my mother's," Ethan said quietly. "The only thing I have left of her. I know we have not been together long, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life." He took the ring from the box and held it up. "Jane Riley, will you marry me?" Jane's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her deeply. And across the room, Miguel woke up just enough to see what was happening and smile before closing his eyes again. They married in early February of 1879, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Santa Fe with Miguel and a few friends as witnesses. Jane wore a cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, and Ethan wore his best suit. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed his bride with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance wiped their eyes. The ranch became truly theirs then, a shared project and a shared home. They worked side by side through the rest of winter and into spring, building up the herd and improving the property. Jane's startled response gradually lessened, though it never disappeared completely. But Ethan never grew impatient with her moments of fear. He simply continued to move quietly around her, to warn her before making loud noises, to hold her when the memories became too much. In May, Jane discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with excitement and a little fear, but mostly with joy. Ethan became even more protective of her, insisting she not overwork herself, making sure she ate well and rested enough. Miguel fussed over her like she was his own granddaughter, preparing special soups and teas that he swore would ensure a healthy baby. Their son was born on a cold January morning in 1880, arriving squalling and healthy into Ethan's waiting hands. They named him Thomas, after Jane's father, and he had his mother's dark hair and his father's creek water eyes. Jane wept when she first held him, overwhelmed by love and gratitude and the miracle of new life. Ethan proved to be a wonderful father, patient and gentle with their son just as he was with everything else. He would walk the floor with Thomas when the baby cried at night, singing soft songs that his own mother had sung to him. He built a cradle with his own hands, sanding it smooth so there were no rough edges, and he carved little wooden animals for Thomas to play with as he grew. The ranch thrived under their joint management. Within 3 years, they had tripled their herd and established a reputation for quality horses. Jane's skill at training combined with Ethan's business sense made them successful beyond what either had imagined. They hired additional hands to help with the work, and Ethan was careful to hire men who were respectful and not too loud, men who understood that the boss lady had her reasons for certain rules and did not question them. In the spring of 1883, Jane gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret after Ethan's mother. She was a quiet baby with a serious expression that made Miguel laugh, declaring she would be a philosopher. Thomas, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and constantly wanted to help take care of her. Life was good, better than Jane had ever dreamed possible during those dark months after her parents' deaths. She still had moments when a loud sound would send her heart racing, but they grew fewer and farther between. And when they happened, Ethan was always there, calm and reassuring, helping her breathe through the panic until it passed. Miguel lived to see both children grow into their early years before he passed peacefully in his sleep in 1885, at the age of 82. They buried him on the ranch, under a cottonwood tree he had always loved, and Jane wept for the man who had been like a grandfather to her. But even in grief, she had Ethan beside her, strong and steady, helping her through the sorrow. The children grew, and the ranch grew with them. Thomas showed an early talent for working with cattle, while Margaret seemed to have inherited her mother's gift with horses. Ethan and Jane raised them with love and discipline, teaching them the value of hard work and the importance of kindness. The children knew their mother sometimes got scared by loud noises, and they learned early to be considerate of this, approaching her gently and keeping their voices moderate in the house. In 1889, when Thomas was 9 and Margaret was 6, Jane gave birth to their third and final child, another son they named Ethan Jr., though everyone called him Junior. He was a boisterous, happy baby who seemed to fill the house with laughter, and his arrival completed their family in a way that felt perfect and right. As the years passed, the ranch became one of the most successful in the territory. People came from all over to buy horses from Jane Riley Masters, and Ethan's reputation as an honest, skilled rancher was well established. They were respected in the community, and their home was known as a place of warmth and welcome. On their 10th wedding anniversary in February of 1889, Ethan surprised Jane with a trip back to Albuquerque. They left the children with a trusted neighbor and retraced the journey they had made together 10 years earlier. The livestock yards were still there, bustling with activity, and they stood at the fence where they had waited for her horses to be auctioned, remembering. "I was so scared that day," Jane said, leaning against Ethan's shoulder. "Scared of the noise, scared of failing, scared of losing everything." "But you did not lose everything," Ethan reminded her. "You saved your ranch, and somewhere along the way, you saved me too." Jane looked up at him, this man who had learned to move quietly around her, who had shown her that she could heal from her wounds, who had loved her with patience and devotion every day of their marriage. "We saved each other," she said. Ethan smiled and kissed her, and they stood there together as the afternoon sun painted the mountains gold. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they had been searching for: peace, love, home. That evening, they returned to their hotel room, the same boarding house where they had stayed 10 years before, and made love with the passion and tenderness of a couple who knew each other completely. Afterward, lying in Ethan's arms, Jane felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Ethan asked, wiping the tears gently with his thumb. "I am just happy," Jane whispered. "So happy I can hardly believe it is real." "It is real," Ethan assured her. "And it is going to keep being real every day for the rest of our lives." They returned home to find the children well and the ranch running smoothly. Life settled back into its comfortable rhythms. Early mornings and honest work, family dinners and bedtime stories, moments of challenge and moments of joy. Jane still flinched occasionally at unexpected sounds, but the response was muted now, manageable, no longer dominating her life. She had learned, with Ethan's help, that she could be wounded and still whole, scared and still strong. As the children grew into young adults, the ranch expanded further. Thomas married a sweet-natured girl from town and brought her to live on the property, building a house near the main homestead. Margaret showed no interest in marriage, preferring to focus on her horses and establishing herself as one of the best trainers in New Mexico. Junior, the youngest, inherited his father's wandering spirit and eventually left to see something of the world, though he always returned home for Christmas and spent his summers working the ranch. Ethan and Jane grew older together gracefully, their hair turning silver, their faces creasing with lines earned from years of laughter and sun. They remained deeply in love, that initial spark having matured into a steady, enduring flame that warmed them both. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch together, holding hands and watching the sunset paint the sky, grateful for every day they had been given. In the summer of 1910, when they were in their early 50s, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, their grandchildren, and friends from all over the territory. It was a grand party with music and dancing, and enough food to feed an army. At one point, Ethan took Jane's hand and led her away from the crowd to a quiet spot near the barn where they could look out over the ranch they had built together. 30 years, Ethan said wonderingly. It feels like yesterday and forever at the same time. I know what you mean, Jane said, squeezing his hand. Sometimes I still see you riding up to the house for the first time, taking off your hat, speaking so quietly. I knew then that you were special, Ethan said. I did not know you would become my whole world, but I knew you were someone worth slowing down for. Jane turned to face him fully, reaching up to cup his weathered cheek. You gave me my life back, Ethan. You taught me that I could be broken and still be loved, that wounds could heal even when they left scars. You showed me what it means to be truly known and truly cherished. You did the same for me, Ethan replied. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to stop drifting. You made me believe I was worth something more than just the work I could do. They kissed then, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 30 years of love and commitment and shared joy. When they pulled apart, they stood together looking out over the ranch, watching their family celebrate in the distance, feeling the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. The years continued to pass with increasing speed, as years do when they are filled with happiness. Jane and Ethan remained active on the ranch well into their 60s, though they gradually handed more responsibility to Thomas and Margaret. They took pleasure in their grandchildren, 9 in total by the time the last was born, and they found new ways to enjoy each other's company as the demands of work lessened. Jane's startled response never completely disappeared, but by the time she was 60, it had faded to little more than an occasional slight jump at truly unexpected sounds. Ethan never stopped being considerate of it, never stopped moving a bit more quietly than necessary, never stopped warning her before he made a loud noise. It had become second nature to him, this careful attention to her needs, just as her love and trust had become the bedrock of his existence. In the spring of 1925, when Jane was 68 and Ethan was 74, they sat together on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The ranch was thriving under Thomas's management, the grandchildren were growing into fine young people, and the sunset was particularly spectacular that evening, all orange and pink and purple spreading across the endless New Mexico sky. I have had a good life, Jane said contentedly, her hand in Ethan's as always. We have, Ethan agreed, a very good life. Do you ever think about that first day, Jane asked, when you rode up to the house and I was so frightened I could barely speak to you? I think about it often, Ethan said. I think about how you were the bravest person I had ever met, even though you were terrified. I think about how I almost rode past your ranch that day, almost went on to the next town. What made you stop? Jane asked, though she had heard the story before and would never tire of hearing it again. Something told me this was the place I had been looking for, Ethan said simply. Something told me that if I kept riding, I would miss the most important thing I would ever find. And that something was right. Jane smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars emerged. They had built a life together out of loneliness and loss, out of patience and understanding, out of love that grew stronger with each passing year. They had raised children and cattle, horses and dreams. They had weathered storms and celebrated triumphs. They had been, in every way that mattered, partners. As the sky darkened and the air grew cool, they finally stood and walked hand in hand into the house they had made a home, into the life they had created together, into the love that had sustained them through 47 years of marriage and would sustain them still through whatever years remained. Behind them, the ranch settled into its evening quiet, the cattle bedded down, the horses dozing in their stalls, the land resting under a blanket of stars. It was a place of peace, just as Ethan had said all those years ago, a place where they could take deep breaths and not worry about what came next, a place where they belonged and where they would always, always be missed if they left. It was home, built by a cowboy who learned to move quietly and a woman who learned to trust again, two wounded souls who found healing in each other's gentle care. And as the door closed behind them and the light from their window glowed warm against the darkness, the ranch stood testament to what they had built together. Not just a successful business, not just a family legacy, but a love story that had started with consideration and grown into something transcendent, something lasting, something that would echo through generations long after they were gone. Thomas would one day tell his grandchildren about his parents, about how his father had courted his mother with patience and care, how his mother had been the strongest woman he ever knew, despite the fears she carried. Margaret would train horses using the methods her mother taught her, always approaching with gentleness and understanding. Junior would eventually settle down too, finding his own love and bringing her back to the ranch, building yet another house on the land that held his family's history. And through all of it, through all the years and generations to come, the story of Ethan and Jane would be remembered as a reminder of what love could do. It could heal wounds that seemed permanent. It could build homes from ruins. It could teach a cowboy to move quietly and give a frightened woman the courage to live again. It could transform two lonely people into a family into a legacy into a love that would never be forgotten. The ranch prospered for decades after, passing from Thomas to his children and then to theirs, each generation adding their own chapter to the story while honoring the foundation that Ethan and Jane had built. The main house stood for over a century, and visitors would sometimes comment on the unusually well-oiled hinges on all the doors, the leather-wrapped handles on the water pumps, the careful construction that minimized creaking and banging throughout the structure. Those who knew the history would smile and explain that the ranch had been built by a man who loved a woman enough to change how he moved through the world, and by a woman who loved a man enough to believe she could heal. It had been built on consideration and patience, on understanding and respect, on the simple but profound recognition that true love means seeing someone's pain and choosing to ease it rather than dismiss it. Ethan Masters passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1928, at the age of 77. He went to bed holding Jane's hand, as he had done every night of their married life, and he simply did not wake up. Jane, 71 years old and still strong despite her grief, buried him on the ranch beside Miguel, under the cottonwood trees that stood guard over the land they had all loved. She lived another 12 years without him, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still working with horses well into her 80s, still jumping slightly at unexpected loud sounds, but no longer letting those moments of fear define her. She spoke often of Ethan, keeping his memory alive through stories of his kindness and humor, his strength and gentleness, the way he had ridden into her life when she needed him most and stayed forever. When Jane Riley Masters passed away quietly in her sleep in the spring of 1940, at the age of 83, her family buried her beside her husband under those same cottonwood trees. The headstones were simple but elegant, bearing their names and dates and a single inscription that Thomas had chosen, words his father had spoken many times over the years. Home is where you belong. And so their story ended where it had truly begun, on the ranch in Santa Fe, New Mexico, surrounded by the land they had worked and the family they had raised and the love that had carried them through every challenge and every joy. It was a story of healing and hope, of patience and perseverance, of a cowboy who learned to move quietly near a woman who flinched at every loud sound, and of how that one small act of consideration blossomed into a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. The ranch still stands, though the family sold it in the 1970s to a conservation trust that preserved the property as an example of historical New Mexico ranching. The main house is now a museum, and visitors can walk through the rooms where Ethan and Jane lived and loved, can see the careful construction details that reveal how much he cared for her comfort, can stand on the porch where they spent countless evenings watching the sunset together. There is a display in the parlor, behind glass, that contains a few precious artifacts. A photograph of Ethan and Jane on their wedding day, both looking young and hopeful. The silver and turquoise ring that Ethan gave Jane when he proposed. A worn leather journal where Jane recorded her thoughts and feelings over the years, and a small wooden carving that Ethan made for her, a perfect miniature of a horse mid-gallop, captured forever in a moment of grace and power. Beside these artifacts is a placard that tells their story in brief, the tale of a frightened woman and a gentle cowboy, of love that grew from kindness and consideration into something eternal. Visitors read the words and look at the photograph, at the young couple frozen in time, and they feel the echo of that great love still resonating through the walls and floors and rafters of the house. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the museum has closed and the last visitors have departed, the caretakers swear they can hear soft footsteps on the porch, the gentle murmur of voices, the sound of two people who found in each other everything they had been searching for, and who will never truly leave the place where they built their life together. It is a fitting end to a love story that began with understanding and grew into legend, a reminder that the greatest romance is not found in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in the daily choice to honor another person's needs, to ease their pain, to stand beside them through whatever storms may come. It is the story of Ethan Masters, who learned to move quietly, and Jane Riley, who learned to trust again, and the beautiful life they built together in the wild heart of New Mexico, under vast skies that witnessed their love and blessed it with every star.